Hello, everyone, and welcome to the virtual ROC workshop series, module number 5. My name is Laura Dubin, and I'm a technical assistance provider with RCAC. I am joined today by my two co-facilitators.
I'm Nick Dorr with Opportunity Link in Havre, Montana.
I'm Madison Wilhite with the Native American Development Corporation in Billings, Montana. Let's take a moment to recognize our funder. The Virtual ROC Workshop Series was developed and is being facilitated by RCAC and its local partners, thanks to generous funding from the U.S. Department of Commerce Minority Business Development Agency. During Module 1, we discussed the 8 forms of assets or resources that exist in every community, and we used the spider diagram to evaluate the strength or weakness of each type of asset in your community. During Module 2, we introduced value chains and discussed how these differ from traditional supply chains. We also looked at 3 types of value chain partners and the levels of interest and how each is needed to construct and implement a value chain. During Module 3, we introduced the Ice House Discovery Canvas and used that to reframe your economic opportunity into a solution that addresses a community problem. During Module 4, we introduced connecting with demand partners by developing an elevator pitch and testing the demand for your economic opportunity. In this module, we'll learn how to identify gaps and opportunities within your value chain and evaluate the impacts of your product, service, or project. If you need a refresher, feel free to watch any of the previous videos again. If you have any questions, you can always post them to your community's ROC Facebook group or ask during the online interactive session. The learning objectives for this module are to re-examine value chains, to identify missing pieces that translate into opportunities for business or job creation, evaluate the potential impact of value chains on local assets and resources, and utilize tools and data to continuously adapt value chains. The handouts for this module are available in your workbook so you can follow along. They include the Module 5 PowerPoint slides with space next to each slide for notes, the Gaps and Opportunities activity, the criteria scoring definitions, and the criteria scoring activity.
In the previous modules, we practiced mapping out our value chains and canvassing the demand. From canvassing the demand, we learned important information, including if there are new partners that we didn't know about yet, if there are any existing solutions to the problem that our value chains address, and most importantly, if the demand exists. Do customers want our solution to the problem? Are they willing to pay for it? At this point in ROC, it's important to reflect back on what we've learned and add any new data into the value chain. Now let's talk about how the value chain can become a communications tool. If you remember from previous modules, open, transparent communication is a necessity for a value chain. There should be trust between the partners, and trust stems from open communication. Another aspect you may start to see is that value chains are not static. They are dynamic, fluid, evolving networks. This is what separates a value chain from a traditional supply chain. As you build out a value chain, the coordinators and core partners will begin to interact through meetings, smaller exchanges, and the sharing of information. By using your value chain as a communications tool, you can start to discover things that are happening, things that are not happening, any barriers that may exist, and any new offers, ideas, or opportunities that come to light. You can follow along with the next slides using your Gaps and Opportunities handout from the workbook. Now that you've mapped out your value chain and you understand that there always has to be interest and a leader or coordinator, we want you to look critically at your value chains with an eye out for gaps, bottlenecks, and underutilized resources. Let's begin with what those terms are. A gap is a missing process or function in your value chain. This could be a step in getting your product or service to market that you haven't accounted for yet, or something that doesn't exist locally yet. A bottleneck is something that prevents the flow of the value chain. Is there a blockage somewhere that is preventing smooth operations or growing the scale? This could be a regulatory issue, a lack of skills for a particular step, or a lengthy amount of time it takes to accomplish a step. An underutilized resource is a resource that already exists within your region, but is just not being used fully yet. This could be a local person who has knowledge and skills related to your product or service, or it could be part of the product itself that needs to be lifted up and supported. Looking critically at your value chain, you will start to identify those gaps. Let's talk about how to fill them. How can gaps be turned into opportunities? A gap is an opportunity to fill it with a local supplier. It could be filled by an already existing business or entrepreneur, or even an organization. Are they able to expand their capacity to fill that gap? Or would someone new have to come in? If there is a gap that can lead to a new venture, think about who would take that on. Is there someone within the community, or perhaps a partner outside of the community? This can lead to a chainlet or a smaller value chain that stems from your original value chain. This is part of the ROCE process that sparks new economic opportunities within the community. Consider what opportunities can stem from filling the gaps that you find in your value chain. How you fill a gap, whether with an existing business or organization or a new entrepreneur, will help determine how best to move your value chain forward. Welcome to the Gaps and Opportunities demonstration for Module 5. On the wall behind me, you can see that I have the value chain map listed out for our community cooperative farm scenario. In keeping with our theme of using what you have at home available, as you can see, I am not using note cards. I'm using a dry erase board that I have and different colored markers that I have available in my home. So please don't worry about using whatever materials you have available to map out your value chain. Let's start our scenario off by reading through the partners that we have listed, and I'll point out the partners that we've added on in our live demonstrations or since our live demonstrations. Let's begin with our demand partners for the cooperative farm. We're starting out with our 3,500 local residents who would be interested in purchasing the fresh produce, the local restaurant ROCE's, the K through 12 schools who would use the produce for their school lunches. And then in our live sessions, and since then, we've added on some additional demand partners, including the Head Start program, the Veterans Center that serves food, and the Senior Center that also serves food. For our transactional partners, we started out with Tribal Land Department, the local Acme grocery store, the cooperative farm, the hardware store, which has a question mark next to it, and we'll circle back around to that in a moment. And since our Module 2 demonstration, we've added in 2 additional transactional partners in the live sessions, the Tribal Utilities Department and the seed retailer. For our support partners, we started out with the Intertribal Agricultural Council, the Cooperative Development Center, a local nonprofit that's focused on buying locally, and a bank. Now you'll notice here it says bank/CDFI. In our live session, we understood that the CDFI would be a more appropriate financial institution for funding. So we've updated the name of the partner here. This is an example of how you can always go back to your value chain and update and edit it as necessary. This can be as you get new information or you find new or better partners to list. It's always okay to go back and edit, and it's actually encouraged to do. We've also added 2 additional partners in the live sessions, the IHS Clinic and the Community College. So this is our starting map for our community cooperative farm scenario. Now let's talk about gaps and opportunities. Let's start with gaps, and we'll start by looking at our transactional partners. We'll use some low-hanging fruit here, the hardware store, since we already know that this was a question mark. We know that the cooperative farm needs a hardware store to supply some of the equipment necessary to running the farm. However, it was mentioned in the community scenario that there is no local hardware store. So how do you fill this gap? Well, you can either drive to the border town and purchase your hardware supplies there. That's quite a drive away, and it also doesn't keep the money local to your community. Another option would be to see if you can fill the gap locally. Is there an existing business that can expand their capacity to sell hardware supplies? If not, is there a local entrepreneur who's perhaps interested in starting their own business and selling these supplies to meet the demand? This is an example of the gaps and opportunities exploration process. You're looking at your partners, you're asking questions, you're finding gaps that need to be filled, and thinking about ways that you can fill those gaps. Now let's move on to bottlenecks. This is where things can get hung up in your value chain process. It was mentioned in the community scenario that the land would need to be leased for the cooperative farm. Since the land is tribal trust land, there may be a lengthy process in order for the land lease to be approved from both the tribe and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This can be considered a bottleneck because it's slowing down the entire process of your value chain, and it needs to be addressed. But how can it be addressed? It will take time to formally develop and submit a request that the land be leased for farming and selling of produce. A community member, or maybe even a technical assistance provider, could be able to dedicate the time to work with the tribe and the Bureau of Indian Affairs to work through the bottleneck and assist in moving the value chain forward. We know that leasing the land is a necessary element for the value chain. So in this case, planning ahead and being proactive can be beneficial in ultimately getting the product to the market. So we can address the bottleneck of leasing the land by working with a community member or a technical assistance provider. So let's add them into our value chain map now. Where do you think they would go? I think they would fall under the support partner because they are supporting the transactional partners and moving the value chain process forward and ultimately helping to get the product or service to the market. So let's add them in here. And you can see I'm writing TAP, that's the acronym for Technical Assistance Provider. Now let's take a look at underutilized assets. We know from our list of demand partners that the local schools are interested in purchasing the fresh produce to use in their school lunches. Throughout our initial conversations with the schools, they told the cooperative farm that they need certain produce processed before they can begin to cook with it. They mentioned that the carrots have to be chopped a certain way and the beans have to be shelled and pre-soaked. All of the food handling has to be done in a certified commercial kitchen. How can this issue be resolved? Who could process the vegetables? Thinking back to some of the local assets we discussed at the start of the community scenario in modules 1 and 2, it was mentioned that there's a community center that also has a commercial kitchen in it. Perhaps the community center with the kitchen can be a transactional partner to process the vegetables before sending them off to the school. This is an example of an underutilized asset because the community center kitchen already exists within the community, but it's not being used to its full potential. And here's the perfect opportunity to use that asset. So let's go ahead and add that in to our transactional partners. Okay. Let's think about another possible underutilized asset. Since the cooperative farm is new, not all of the members may be very familiar with farming practices. They may need some assistance and some advice from time to time to get the business up and running and to actually grow the produce successfully. This is another need or gap within the value chain network. So who could the cooperative farm turn to for advice? Perhaps a local mentor. Is there somebody within the community that has experience with farming practices that could assist the cooperative farm or provide advice? This could be another example of an underutilized asset. Find somebody locally who has the skills or expertise you need that you can partner with or bring into your value chain to help it be successful. So let's go ahead and add in a local farm mentor to our list of partners. And I'm going to call them a support partner because they'll be providing specific advice and support to move the products forward. There we go, farming mentor. These are some examples of how you can work through your partners to identify gaps and opportunities in your value chain network. So don't be afraid to look critically at your value chain and use the information and the needs that you have to start filling some of those gaps. Now we are going to take the review process one step further and look at how we can adapt value chains based on the data you learned from the previous tools and questions. When does the canvassing process end? The canvassing process never really ends. As we discussed earlier in the module, value chains can become a communications tool in which you are always discovering new information, new or changing demand, and finding opportunities to fill gaps. Value chains are driven by demand, so as the demand shifts and evolves, so should your product, service, or project. So how do you adapt? You can apply your learning to edit your value chain. You may discover that your product or service or project just won't work. Or you validate your concept and continue moving it forward. Needs will grow and change, and new problems will always arise, so new solutions can be created. Once your value chain develops solid, trusting relationships with demand partners, they can help to identify new market opportunities and new product ideas. Getting to this kind of relationship with demand partners is key to developing resiliency.
As a refresher, the WealthWorks foundational principles are part of the value chain process. They are create assets or build up existing assets, to do no harm, to increase local ownership, control, and influence, and to build lasting livelihoods that are inclusive of all people. Now we're going to take a look at the criteria score definitions handout. What is criteria scoring? It's one tool to help evaluate your value chain and measure impacts. It's intended to evaluate the impacts of the economic opportunity you are considering. The point of the exercise is to consider different criteria and how they are impacted. So the 8 forms of assets and how they are impacted. Demand, does this idea, product, or service have possibility beyond the local market? Is this economic opportunity rooted in local ownership and control? Does this economic opportunity contribute to the overall health and well-being or livelihood in the community? It also tests assumptions. Sometimes what seems most obvious to everyone is really not what a community wants or needs. Now we're going to take a closer look at that handout. Inclusivity and benefits. What is the potential for including and benefiting economically marginalized people in places as producers, consumers, laborers, or through reduced costs? Will the intended beneficiaries recognize these as benefits? What would a benefit look like from their perspective? Demand. What is the opportunity on the demand side? Is this a growing industry? Is there an opportunity to create demand? Are there obvious potential demand partners? Potential for scale. What is the likelihood of bringing this value chain to a meaningful scale? How many livelihoods could it impact if it were built out? What are the various pathways to scale that you can imagine? Systems change potential. What is the potential to achieve significant scale over time and ultimately to institutionalize the value chain and make it the new normal? What is the potential to transform an entire system? How are you defining scale? Multiple forms of assets. What is the potential of this value chain for positively impacting multiple forms of wealth while doing no harm? Ownership and control. What is the potential for creating or strengthening structures of ownership and control that will help keep wealth local and benefit economically marginalized peoples and places? Competitiveness. Can this value chain be created in a way that makes it competitive with other alternatives? What is the comparative advantage of the WealthWorks value chain? How is the value chain tied to place-based resources and characteristics? Production potential. Do you have the raw materials, natural and human, that can be engaged to produce the goods or services you are envisioning? How realistic are you being? How much investment would be needed to bring underutilized assets into production and at what scale? And finally, energy and enthusiasm. The amount of energy and enthusiasm stakeholders express constitutes an important consideration in determining whether to move forward with a given value chain during exploration. However, this should not necessarily be a criterion for value chain selection, because you may not yet be talking to the demand and transactional partners that matter most. Now we're going to take a look at the criteria score activity handout. It's a scale of 1 to 3, where 1 represents low and 3 is high. You rate each category based on the potential impacts or impacts of your value chain. Use the category descriptions as the guidance on what to consider for your rating. Explain your choices next to your rating. This is an important and useful tool for value chains, but also any enterprise you're working on or considering. You can keep using this in the future for other projects as they arise. Now we're going to take a closer look at 2 areas of criteria scoring. If we look at our definitions for systems change potential, what is the potential to achieve significant scale over time and ultimately to institutionalize the value chain and make it the new normal? What is the potential to transform an entire system? How are you defining scale? Using this definition, we can give this a high score, or a 3, because the co-op has the potential to create an entirely new value chain by changing local food systems. While previously community members were leaving to do their shopping in the nearby border town, the co-op provides an alternative way for community members to purchase food without traveling large distances. Additionally, this increases people's access to both fresh food and food security. Multiple forms of assets. What is the potential of this value chain for positively impacting multiple forms of wealth while doing no harm? We have given multiple forms of assets a score of 3, or a high potential for change. Looking at our definitions of the 8 forms of assets from Module 1, we are able to see that the co-op will have impacts on several different forms of assets. If you'll remember back to the value chain we talked about in Module 2, here are a couple of the specific impacts on assets in our value chain. Individual has the potential to improve the health of individuals with better diets. Financial has the potential to save time and money for residents by not having to travel far for fresh produce. Those were just 2 examples of how we can measure the impact of our value chain.
The Module 5 activities are to complete the Gaps and Opportunities activity for your value chain or the community scenario, use the criteria scoring activity to determine how your value chain or the community scenario would impact the community, consider how you can edit your value chain based on the information you've learned. Please be prepared to discuss these activities during your community's online interactive session. You have completed Module 5 for the virtual ROC workshop series. Check the date and times for your community's online interactive session where you will be discussing your economic opportunity as a value chain. In the meantime, please feel free to post your thoughts and questions about Module 5 in your community's Facebook group. You can also contact me, Madison Wilhite, with the Native American Development Corporation, or Nick Dorr with Opportunity Link Incorporated if you have questions. Our contact information is included in the front of your workbook.